Thank you very much, Sergey. The advantage of speaking after many distinguished speakers is that I think a large part of my job has already been done. So I will focus only on those which have not done. There is a long presentation. I will not go through all of it, but let me just give the main points that I would like to emphasize. The first is that the discussion on sanctions must be placed within the overall approach to enforcement of competition law and policy. So it is one of the many tools that the agency will have to put in place for enforcing the law, and not the only one. That's the first element. Maybe that's a slide, please. The second point to mention, and I think also was mentioned earlier, is that sanction and remedies complement each other. I will not go, as I said, I will not go through all of the presentation because it's rather long, and many of the points have already been covered. And therefore, the purpose of sanctions can be either in terms of deterrence, or they can seek to be punitive. Now, I think also it's important to distinguish at this stage of the discussion between criminal sanctions and administrative and civil sanctions, in the sense that criminal sanctions are not related in any way directly to the harm that they cause, because the purpose of criminal offenses is to eradicate the conduct, and therefore there is no link in there, whereas the discussion on civil and administrative are linked to the harm they are causing. I think since it's the discussion we've argued. But the way I presented the presentation here is to say that I think it's very important to ask what is required of the undertaking in business and what is required from the Anti-Monopoly Committee. And on the first point, which there are a large number of slices on this, is the need to put in place a compliance mechanism. That the undertakers in the business themselves need to put in place a compliance mechanism, a voluntary compliance with the law, and this will avoid many of the problems that will limit their freedom to engage in trade and will sanction some of the profits they will be able to make if they comply with the law. I think this is very important. And that requires compliance at the highest level from the head of the agencies, the resources, including sanctions within the undertaking, that the undertaking themselves can sanction rogue conduct by a certain member of the undertakings. So this part of the compliance, I think, is very important. But business cannot do compliance alone. The Anti-Monopoly Committee is in a better position to explain to the undertaking and business community what is it that they're supposed to comply with. And for this, I think we've had a discussion about the need for legal certainty, need to explain exactly what the law means and what is it that each business needs to comply, what are in terms of abuse of dominance or anti-competitive agreement, excessive pricing, etc. So I think they need clarity for this, having alongside the guidelines that have been suggested, not only on something specifically on sanctions and cases, but also on compliance program. And this will be, I think, extremely important, because there is a link, and some of the best practices in EU and worldwide, that in some of mitigating factor that appears is whether the enterprises have a compliance program and whether that compliance program is being enforced effectively. The second element that I think is so important to mention, in addition to the compliance program, that what the enterprises themselves ought to do, is to explain in cases of a breach or violation of a competition law, how the sanction can be done. Here again, I think it's important to emphasize two elements. First is the content of sanction in the legislative part, in other words, in the law itself. And this perhaps is something that maybe could be considered in the next revision of the anti-monopoly law. That what exists already there could be revised to take into account the changes in the law. The second part of the enforcement of the sanction is the part which deals with determining specific sanctions in specific case, and what are the elements that need to be taken in there. And this is a very complex issue. I think it's not only for young agencies or middle-aged agencies like the anti-monopoly committees, but even more mature in US, in Germany, and other EU struggle with the technical issues of how to determine the specific case involving this. Now, some of these, I think they were already alerted to. One of the questions that were raised earlier is the question of the definition of relevant market. And I don't want to get into too much detail, but let me just draw some of the points which I think are very critical and which are not addressed in the guideline. The first is that the definition of relevant market, I think, is very important. But what is very specifically required here from the determination, because the law general only give a maximum ceiling, but does not provide what should be the range of the fines based on the, and here I think the question is whether there is a inappropriate translation of the word profit or excess profit into an advantage. My reading was that perhaps maybe some editing of the text would bring out excessive profit or profit above the competitive level that would determine what is the advantage. And I think this will be more useful to determine what is the excessive profit or profit that is above the competitive level, competitive price level. But the problem is extremely difficult to determine, because if you ask yourself from an economic point of view, what is profit? By definitions from economic 100 is that it's the total cost, total revenue minus total costs. And your total revenues are the price you charge times the total sales you collect plus the cost. But when you go to the market and you want to determine the price, which price do you look at? You're going to look at the price on the tags on market. But is that a competitive price, or is it the monopolist price? Or is it something in between? So you do not know exactly whether that price that you're going to calculate, you're going to obtain on the market, is the competitive. Because if you are already in a situation where, let's say, there are only two competitors, there might be competition, but there are only two players, the price might be already the price which is 10, 20% above the competitive prices if you had four competitors. But you don't have four competitors. So if you use that price, you would already have an underestimation of what the advantage or the excessive profit will be in place. That's the first part. The second element, which you need detailed information, and I think the notice would need to look at, not so much in differential relevant market, but also the relationship between the price and the so-called elasticity of demand. In other words, how does the demand respond to prices? For example, if you look at in petrol, the demand for petrol for car is wherever it is, you will buy it. So the ability to find a substitute is very limited. Whereas if you look at some consumer goods, let's say food items, you might find substitutes. And therefore, if the price changes very small, you can move to substitutes, which is another element of the determinate relevant market. But to obtain the elasticity of demand, the detailed statistic of this is very difficult to obtain element for that. But that should be, in my view, as part, I think, in annex or detailed guidelines on what should be the determinant of the excessive profit. And then relating to this, I said, if you have a market where there is a value, it's a new product, maybe the price will be relatively quite high because it's just into the market. But that's normal revenue. It's not excessive revenues. If you use the first formula, which is the competitive price should be, because that's what it is outside, but this is not in relevant market here, then you would overestimate the profit or the excessive profit that you think will come out from the discussion. So those are, I think, are extremely important elements which are relevant here. This is just if you have one enterprise. But most of the cases, suppose you have a cartel or 2 or 3 companies involved, one at distribution level and one which are at the production level, then you have to determine what is the part of each of these parties. Who is responsible for what? Because, for example, if you are on top, you're selling, the wholesaler, and you are engaged in excessive pricing, you pass it to me. I will pass it on to somebody else. Now, well, are we going to count the excessive price, and the excessive price will be double counting, because all I did is pass on our price that were charged. I passed on to the distributor, who might pass it on to the consumer. So you have to be very, very careful in how to calculate the so-called excessive advantage that you may have in stage 1, stage 2, and to total market for this. So this is an extremely complex exercise, which I think there are some good econometrics techniques which are available for doing work. But it isn't easy to do, because the raw material, the data, the information you need to have is extremely very important and may not be available. And this is perhaps why many competition agencies would not bind themselves with a specific methodology, because you may not be able to implement it. But it's important at least to discuss it and bring it out in discussion here. And then if it is a cartel, as I said, a number of elements were mentioned. Among the aggravating factor, one is the duration. It's very difficult to obtain data. And when did actually the cartel start? When this product set? For that, you need to be able to compel the business to provide you with that data. And one of the, I think many of the peer reviewers have identified this, that the Anti-Monopoly Committee need to have its power reinforced in order to compel businesses to provide this type of information and to cooperate. Because without providing this information, it is very difficult to have, let's say, a fair and transparent way that you would say this is what the harm has been done and how much, I would say, damages or sanction can be applied to it. Related to this question of the data, I think in the guidelines, there are a number of percentages that have been proposed, around 45 for cartel, 35 for abuse of dominance, and 7 for merger. Well, coming with the last one, I'm a bit surprised that there will be sanction on mergers, because usually mergers are not antitrust. Just company want to merge, so I'm a bit surprised that there are proposals for sanctioning. If this for non-reporting data, I mean, that will be different. But if it is for merger, I mean, that's one question to ask. The second question is, what are these percentages on? When you say 45%, are they of the total market? Yeah, but okay. But now the question for this is that normally if you want deterrence, deterrence should be on 100% of the market. If let's say, a cartel has abused, let's say, or engaged in excessive overpricing for the relevant market of, let's say, 10 million, which is the domestic market, then normally the current practice and best practice worldwide is 100% of that. And in the US, it's triple damages. It's 3 times what damage has been done for cases. So I didn't understand why only 45% of the damage will be sanctioned. Yeah, sorry. Anyway, I mean, just my comment. If it is a percentage of the relevant market, of the damage done, then the question is, why should? Yeah, but why, if we have 100% which is subject to cartel, why should we only calculate the damage on a 50% of the relevant market? Yeah, but then it is on the 100% market, not 54% of the market. This is my question. It's just as a comment on this. It was a clarification on whether what does the percentage refer to? If it refers to the relevant market, which is subject and is domestic, not international. I think if international, this will be a huge amount of money. But if it is, let's say, the domestic market or the regional market in one of the territories of Ukraine, then the practice would mean, if we seek deterrence, then it should be on the 100% of that market if it is affected. And then beyond that, then the cost will be whatever percentage could be applied on the 100% of the market. And I think one also have to remember that, which maybe the guideline take implicitly into account, is that more and more, and I think this will be also the case in Ukraine, is that there will be more private action taken back on this, and other follow-up actions on these cases. So perhaps that should also be taken into account in the guidelines. One last point, which I think will take us to the next session discussion, which is on transparency, is that there is really a balance between how much transparency the guideline should provide and how much does it undermine the deterrence effect. Because clearly, a lot of empirical evidence shows that cartels are rational, profit-maximizing individuals. So if you provide 100% of transparency with all information, there is totally nothing unknown, all of it will be factored in the cost. And we'll say, can I pay first? And let me get on with my cartel. So you've got to strike a balance between an stochastic element, a little bit of unknown, and for the law to actually be effective. Thank you.